Offer welcome from Los Alamos National Laboratory and from some of my colleagues here and myself. There has been, in the United States and around the world, a number of indications of growing interest in nuclear power, driven by projected electricity demand, concerns about energy security and independence, about global warming, and other issues. There's, I think, a growing belief that we are entering or in the midst of a nuclear renaissance, while some skeptics view that as somewhat premature. A nuclear debate is emerging, however, that promises to be as contentious as that in the 1970s. The context and some of the specific issues of that debate have changed from the 1970s, although many are similar. But the debate will hinge not only on economics, but on safety, security, and non-proliferation issues. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was in many ways a product of the debate of the 70s and concern about a conflict of interest within the Atomic Energy Commission. It split off from the Atomic Energy Commission as did IRDA, the forerunner of DOE. And as the nation's nuclear regulator, very distinct from the promotional function that DOE serves, the NRC is responsible for safety, security, and other issues that will very much affect the future of nuclear power. To discuss the role of and the challenges to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we are fortunate to have one of its commissioners, Peter B. Lyons. Pete was sworn in as commissioner on January 25th, 2005. Before that, he had served as a science advisor to Senator Pete Domenici and on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Before working in Congress, Pete had held a number of positions, and I had the pleasure to work with him on a number of occasions at Los Alamos National Laboratory. PhD in astrophysics from the California Institute of Technology and a fellow of the American Physical Society, Pete has distinguished himself at every stage of his career and in both the academic and policy worlds. Pete.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks, Rob. It's good to be with you here at the Wilson Center. I was sitting in this same room probably with a number of you. Certainly a number of folks I recognize around the room were with me a week ago for the sessions with the Baker Center. And those were a fascinating set of presentations on pros and cons, different issues related to nuclear power and some of the challenges we're going to face. I'll be addressing it today from the perspective of the NRC, which is different than most of the perspectives you heard last week. And our focus, as you heard from our chairman a week ago, very much has to be on the safety and security of whatever is done in this country utilizing nuclear technologies for commercial applications. My prepared slides will be relatively few, talking mainly about some of the very high-level challenges we have, with a focus probably on some of the human resource challenges. But I'm guessing that in questions we can get into hopefully a very wide range of subjects. Just to mention some of the areas that I'm not going to talk about but might come up in questions. I was privileged to have a fascinating trip to India within the last year. I certainly have very strong views on the U.S.-India potential agreement and its importance to us. HEU exports, something that I dealt with frequently in Congress, and now I'm dealing with it from the perspective of the NRC, and also a very interesting subject. GNEP, we heard a lot about that last week. There's nothing in my slides specific to GNEP, but the whole idea of a nuclear renaissance kind of underpins the need for a relook at a number of the technologies that are being viewed now as quite integral to GNEP. So GNEP may well come up. I was also at the IAEA General Conference just about a month ago with a number of fascinating interchanges. So all those hopefully can come up in questions. But to launch into a few slides, since I was coming to the Wilson Center and with its very, very distinguished history, I wanted to start off by demonstrating that the NRC has long-standing roots. And if this doesn't work, so much for my joke. Okay. I wanted to show that the NRC indeed traces its roots back a long, long ways, far further than the 1974 creation. And this may not be a completely appropriate quote, but tying back to the Federalist Papers, which admittedly is a stretch, does give some recognition to the importance, even back that far, that was well recognized in our government for the need for stability and predictability, and that very, very much ties into the regulatory regime.
You can advance it with the button, the arrows there, I believe, as well.
Maybe that will be a faster way of doing it. Joe, in his introduction, mentioned a nuclear renaissance, and certainly the NRC will be very, very challenged if that renaissance does occur. I've indicated here on the slide our so-called strategic objective, and honestly that objective stays the same whether we're talking about a nuclear renaissance or business as usual today. But the words in this strategic objective, which was adopted by the Commission well before I joined them, I think are very, very well chosen. And the only word that I would really focus on is it starts with the word enable. It's certainly not to promote. We're definitely not a promoter. And we have to constantly make sure that we don't cross into anything that could be interpreted as promotion. But by the same token, our job is not to block. There are, as all of you in this room know, incredibly important beneficial uses of nuclear technology. And I think that as previous commissions chose the word enable to start this strategic objective, I think it was a good choice. Certainly we're responsible for for adequate safety, public health and safety, common defense and security. But to me, framing all we do from the standpoint of enabling the beneficial uses at the same time that we're maintaining safety and security is a very good way of framing the responsibilities of the NRC. Joe already mentioned some of the drivers that might lead to a nuclear renaissance. Growth in electricity use certainly would not be a surprise to you. It's continuing depending on which projections you want to use. We're going to need of the order of 40 to 50% more power by 2030. If I go back to my days on Senate staff, I was convinced then, and I'm still convinced, that for our nation to accomplish that, we are going to have to make effective use of a wide range of different energy technologies. And in my mind, there is simply no silver bullet. The demand is almost inexorable, and we will be greatly challenged as a nation to meet it. And of course, I'm sure that in other of your deliberations, you've talked about the even more rapid growth in electricity requirements in developing countries, and where we may be looking at a factor of 40 to 50% increase by 2030. Several developing nations are looking at factors of 2 or more, and they will be even more challenged. You can come up with a very, very wide array of factors in addition to demand that may drive a nuclear renaissance. Joe mentioned global warming and certainly increasing concerns about emissions of greenhouse gases. And that has led to a number of so-called environmentalists over the last few years starting to speak quite favorably of nuclear as being at least a part of the solution. Cost, nuclear has typically been one of the lowest cost providers, and it is now, in surveys that I've seen recently, now well below coal in terms of cost. And of course, natural gases and oil would be astronomical on those same charts. Certainly, when we talk about cost, we're talking about existing plants for which the capital has already been amortized many times over. But there are a number of utilities, as I'll show you in a minute, that have gone through the equations to look at the potential benefits, the cost risks from a new plant, and are still speaking to us very favorably about new plants. Other areas I'd mention as being important as we look into the future for any power source would be things like diversity of supply. I think the country has been stung several times, and hopefully we've started to learn some of our lessons about over-reliance on any one fuel source. And another subject that I'm sure is very dear to the hearts of many of you, it's very easy to argue that our energy policy has been to some extent coupled, some would say driven by, but at least coupled to some of our military policies over the last few decades. And in my mind, anything that could be done to minimize that coupling is certainly in our national interests.
I would just go with the button there. Do you think?
I'm just going to skip a couple of slides here. Just to jump ahead to the current expressions of interest that we have at the NRC. These are all U.S. utilities that have come in with letters of intent to construct new plants. I've indicated there both the number of COLs, which stands for Combined Operating License, and I'll come back to that in just a minute if you're not already familiar with that term. But an application can have more than one unit. So there's a difference between the number of applications and the number of units. A number of the applications will be for 2 units. The different the different types of plants here, we can get into it more in questions if you want that level of detail. But let me just note that of the 5 types listed across the bottom there, 2 of them, the AP1000 and the ESBWR, are the so-called passive design, which offers significant safety advantages as we look into the future. Passive in the sense that significantly fewer operator actions are required in order to address possible accident conditions. The other plants, the EPR, the ABWR, APWR, are, I would say, are more evolutionary plants, providing still more redundancies, and, more safety trains, and certainly excellent designs, but not moving towards the passive characteristics of the first 2. Again, as most of you probably know, the AP1000 is certified by the, that does have a design certification from the NRC. ESBWR has applied for it, and we are still evaluating that application. EPR, the Arriva design, has not yet applied for design certification. We anticipate that later this year. The ABWR, the Advanced Boiling Water Reactor, was certified in the 90s. A number have been built around the country, around the world, a number in Japan and under construction elsewhere. And then the APWR, the Mitsubishi design, also is under construction around the world. Again, I think in Japan. This doesn't project well. If any of you really care, I could send you a even electronic copy of this. But this is a current listing showing all the current plants, and I'm sure it's an eye chart to begin to make it out. But it also shows the anticipated new applications for the COL, ones that we expect this year come in red, ones that we expect next year in yellow. As you may have noticed, the first application, the first full COL, was submitted to the NRC the order of a couple of weeks ago. And that marks, well, many would argue that marks the start of a nuclear renaissance. From the NRC's perspective, we're certainly anticipating far more applications. And in my mind, the extent to which we truly move into a nuclear renaissance will have to go considerably beyond whether applications are submitted to the NRC. Of course, we will be reviewing, analyzing, potentially approving these applications. But that does not commit a company to move ahead with construction. And the amount of company funds that are being committed, of course, is very different in preparing an application as opposed to actually beginning construction. So I think there will be a number of different steps, if you will, indicators of a nuclear renaissance. We've already seen a number of them. We've seen early site permits submitted. We've seen design certifications. Now we have the first COL application. And just last week, we had the first application in almost 20 years for uranium mining in this country. And that's another big change. It's been a long, long time coming to see that potentially on the horizon. Oh, what did I do there? Oh, what did you push to get the full? Is it the square one? That one?
No, the further over.
That one?
No, the one
You do it.
just next to it.
I guess we're back to the start now. Sorry
Well,
about
they had
that.
to break it up into 3 files.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go to file 2.
Would you mind just getting the next file while I go ahead and talk? If you close that, then there's the middle file. I'm sorry. I forgot we had shipped it over in 3 different blocks. It'll be that one. The next slide, when it comes up, talks about our COL process, the Combined Operating License. It's a new approach to licensing. Depending on who you ask, either Congress takes credit for it or NRC takes credit for it. It was included in the Energy Policy Act of 1992. The NRC, I'm told, was well down the path towards moving ahead with this improved licensing process, and the Energy Policy Act of 92 mainly made 100% sure that it was appropriate, let's say. But in any case, in this COL process, it's a one-step licensing approach as opposed to the old two-step. Back for the plants that were constructed in the 70s and 80s, they had to first get a construction license. They had to construct the plant. Then they had to come back in and apply for an operating license. And I'm sure that there are folks in this room who can remember, as I can, situations where plants got a construction license, built the plant, and never operated. And needless to say, that does not encourage utilities to consider the nuclear option looking into the future. In the COL process, the combined license, we're demanding that a utility come in or a vendor come in with a complete design, hopefully one that's already been certified, but if it hasn't, at least one that we're working on certifying. The outcome of the COL process, which includes many opportunities for public comment and public involvement, as everything we do does, the outcome of the COL process is that combined operating license, which says, Mr. Utility, you're authorized, you have a license to construct this plant according to the way you told us you're going to construct it. And if you can prove at the end of that process that you did construct it the way you told us you would, then you automatically have an operating license. That removes a tremendous degree of uncertainty from a utility. But I think it also forces several other things that are very, very beneficial. Probably the most important, I think, is that it forces that a complete design be available up front with a complete safety case. If you've been following the trials and tribulations of the construction in Finland, where Areva is building one of the EPRs, there was not a demand in Finland for a complete design before that plant started. I think Areva would have no hesitation saying that they were embarked on a design-build process. But that meant that there were aspects of that plant that still had to undergo regulatory scrutiny at the same time it was being built. Now, there's been a number of different contributors to delays of that plant in Finland, but I think at least one major one is this very key point, that there was not a complete design with complete regulatory approval available up front. We're hoping to thoroughly avoid that concern here and provide a great deal of certainty to utilities as they move ahead through the COL process. So when I talked a few minutes ago about the first COL submission from the South Texas project, this is the COL. This is what I meant by the COL. At the NRC, we're going to be very, very challenged to handle the number of reviews that are coming in. We've started out from the very start of this process, as the Renaissance perhaps started to take shape, as has the industry, with the recognition that it's very important, if you will, this time around, that we have standardized plants. We sometimes joke at the NRC that we have 104 operating plants and 104 models. It's not quite that bad, but it's almost that bad. And I think that as a nation, we lost many of the benefits that I think have accrued to France with their approach to nuclear in having a very few different models in very large fleets. Here we have, you could say, American individualism, but you also have a whole lot of different plants. We started into this with the idea that the only way we could handle this number of applications was if the applications were highly standardized. And I think industry at the same time recognized that there were tremendous advantages to industry if they too could achieve standardization. So for each of the 5 designs that I showed earlier we're working on, there are design groups working to maintain standardization across the industry. Now, admittedly, for something like the ABWR, for which there's only one application and only one shown on my chart, that means it's a group of 1. Whether there will be more ABWRs, I certainly don't know. But for the applications where there are quite a number of plants coming in, it's extremely important to us that we have that degree of standardization. At the NRC, we've looked at this from the standpoint of trying to focus on reviewing each issue only once, having one review and one position, and trying to maximize the efficiency of our review process as well as the efficiency of the application process for the individual utilities. I can't claim it's working yet, since we have a grand total of 1 COL submitted, and it's for an ABWR, which is a unique plant, which is unique on the chart anyway. I hope that as time goes on, we will be able to show that the industry has been successful in maintaining that standardization, and you've probably heard jokes, as I have, suggesting that the plants will be the same down to the wallpaper. The NRC won't review the wallpaper, but the standardization is something that we care very much about, and I think industry is quite right to care about it a lot too. As we move towards a situation with a number of new plants and the construction of a number of new plants, one of the major areas of concern at the NRC was maintaining safety of the existing plants. We certainly recognize that any glitch in safety at the existing plants is simply unacceptable, first to us, to the American people, to Congress. It can't happen. We are very, very concerned that we maintain the safety and the oversight of the existing plants. At the same time, we recognize that evaluating first the applications for the new plants and then the construction inspections are going to consume an immense amount of effort. That's one of the reasons we're increasing our staff, but another is indicated on this slide. I call it safety-inspired fission, making a play on the fact that our whole business is the safe use of fission. But in this case, what fissioned was our Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation. We've split that into 2. We're continuing NRR with its current mission of safety of the existing plants, and we've created a completely new office, the Office of New Reactors. And all of the activities focusing on the new plants, the construction, the inspection, will be taken up in that new office. Now, as we're hiring staff, and I'll be talking about that quite a bit in a minute, we're definitely not putting all the new staff in the new office, in the Office for New Reactors. We are judiciously moving our seasoned staff among those 2 offices at the same time that we're introducing quite a number of new folks. Another continuing challenge that we have is for research in a number of regulatory topics. One of the more exciting ones and more interesting ones ties in with the safety of digital systems. For those of you who have been in existing plants, you typically see control rooms like this. There will be some digital capabilities in those control rooms, but the control rooms in general look like they did when they were constructed. There are inroads being made for digital systems in U.S. control rooms, but it's quite slow. And it's a very, very distinct contrast if you go to most of the newer plants overseas that have very, very heavy use of digital instrumentation and controls. And I would also say a great deal of attention paid to the interface between the human and the machine. As we look towards the new plants, this is what we're anticipating some of those control rooms would look like. And for the ABWR, that's an actual control room in Japan. This is a significant challenge to the NRC. We're needing to move from a regime of strictly analog controls into a digital world. And that may sound surprising to you that we're facing that kind of a challenge in this day and age and that we didn't move a long time ago. But the simple fact is that we're not in a business where we want to be experimenting with new technologies and new changes, especially in an area like control systems. So the NRC, I think, has probably correctly, rightfully been very, very conservative in approving moves towards digital systems. And that in turn has discouraged, which I think is unfortunate, has discouraged U.S. utilities from moving strongly in this direction. But it's very, very clear that for the new plants, as well as upgrades to the existing plants, that more and more we're going to be moving into the digital world with certainly many safety advantages that can accrue from digital, but there's also many challenges that will accrue from the use of digital systems as well. In this and in many, many areas, we're looking forward to international cooperation, taking advantage of what has been, in many cases, well learned in plants overseas. The last subject I was going to address, and I'll try to keep it brief, is some of our human resource challenges. I've indicated that we need to staff up for these for the new reactor applications, and later the construction, and later the operation. And we've been on quite a hiring binge at the NRC. So far, I might note we've been very, very successful, and I hope that continues. But I think there will be increasing competition for the few graduates that are coming out in these specialties, and I'll show you a few charts on that. I think if the nuclear renaissance really cranks up, the country is going to be immensely challenged to find the workforce that we need, and not just the regulators at the NRC. It'll be the same whether you're talking about welders or electricians or any of 1,000 other specialties. A figure at the NRC that I'm proud of, and it may sound weird when I say it at first, in 2002 at the NRC the average age was 47.8. The average age today is 47.2. Now that doesn't sound like much, except that you stop to figure that 5 years went by. And the good news is that that average didn't go up by 5 years, it dropped by a fraction of a year. We have been making a tremendous effort to hire folks who are relatively early in their careers, 30 to 40% of them straight out of college, and then doing extensive training with them. I think we're reasonably successful, but it doesn't change the fact that we have an immense challenge coming up with of the order of a third of our staff eligible to retire within about 5 years. This slide just attempts to depict the different drivers, the different types of industries that need folks who are trained in nuclear science and nuclear technologies. Any one of you could expand on this list. Obviously, certainly the national labs, certainly anything to do with weapons, with nonproliferation, with utilities, with medical use of radioisotopes. A tremendous range of fields depend on education in nuclear science, and a bunch of related specialties. Health physics, for example, many related specialties that have to go along with this. The nation as a whole has done, I would say, a very poor job of maintaining its educational infrastructure in nuclear engineering and related educational programs. This shows the decrease in the number of university research reactors in this country over time, the decrease in the number of nuclear engineering programs. We're starting to see the number of programs start to creep back up. I think that's very, very positive. I still think that we have an immense challenge with the number that we're going to be needing in the future. If I could put in a plug here for something that I've noted in a number of speeches, when I go to universities and look at their research reactors, in general, they're using instrumentation from the 1950s. I worry very much that the absence of funds from DOE to modernize our university research reactors is certainly not helping in the recruitment of a new generation of nuclear engineers. With very few exceptions, if you walk into a research reactor in this country, you do not get the idea that you're walking into a field that has immense promise for this century. It's something that I'm very concerned about. I'm concerned that the best research reactors I've seen Australia, Japan, China, but not the U.S. I think that's unfortunate, and I think it should be a higher priority in this country. The enrollments are increasing. I mentioned here the more scholarships needed. There has been concern expressed in a number of the items of testimony from the NRC frankly, with the way DOE has handled the engineering programs that are authorized and funded through Congress. We at the NRC very, very strongly support the need for those programs, and we have expressed some concerns in testimony in the current DOE position that the educational programs can be handled as a subset of, or as a, I shouldn't say a subset, as a part of programs like GNAP. I am still far more comfortable with language which admittedly I wrote when I was there, but language which suggests a specific DOE program devoted to nuclear engineering and related specialties. Now, the enrollments are coming back up, and that's certainly very, very positive. That's the good news. But, and I'm not going to go through it here, but if you go through the figures of what's required in this industry, this is nowhere near enough to what this industry is going to require. And in any case, this slide is nothing more than enrollments, and what counts even more is the graduation rates, and they're going up too. But still, I don't view this as anywhere near enough of a success, and still a major challenge. One thing I do as I visit plants around the country is ask how the utilities are working with their local colleges, community colleges and research universities. And I'm certainly told very impressive stories about the way the utilities are working with those colleges. And I think it is showing, but I also think it's an immense challenge. I mentioned the NRC goals in hiring. We're trying to increase by a couple hundred a year. That's at the same time that we have substantial attrition, perhaps low by government standards of the order of 6%, but it doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of folks of my age and older who are retiring. And when we look towards adding 200 a year, we're really hiring about 400 a year to make up for the ones who are retiring. And I think I'll use this as the last slide. I've got a lot more, but I think I'll stop with this and just go to questions. But just to talk a little bit about the international cooperation, which may also be a springboard to questions. At the NRC, we very much regard one of our responsibilities to be assistance to other regulators around the world to assist them in developing strong regulatory systems and maintaining safe operations. You've all heard the statement that an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. And we subscribe to that. We want safe operations everywhere. That leads to many, many bilateral agreements, a number of about 40. In addition, we're very active in IAEA and NEA, many, many task groups and relationships that we have through the international community. In addition, the global marketplace is very much a reality. I don't have slides on it here, but if you look at the number of N-stamped i.e. nuclear qualified vendors in this country, that number has fallen by a factor of about 5 from the 1980s. There were over 500 in the 1980s. There's right at about 100 today. The good news is we still have 100. And the good news is that some of those companies, including ones represented here, are working towards reestablishing capabilities for construction of many of the components here in this country. But there are still major components for which there is no capability in this country and for which there's only one supply in the world. And that would be the very large forgings that come only from Japan, which means that everybody in the world who wants a new plant is in line to get one of those forgings or to get a number of those forgings. But I indicate on the slide, we can talk more about it if you want, the importance of international partnerships, of regulators, the need for research. I mentioned that earlier from the standpoint of digital INC, but in addition, there are so many of our key facilities over the years that we used as we were trying, if you will, to get smart and lay the foundations for nuclear technologies. We don't have those facilities now. So many of our facilities have closed. And in many cases now there's only one or maybe two of a particular type of facility anywhere in the world. So we go where those facilities are. for some of the most important safety research that we're doing. And that brings home, I think, the importance of that international collaboration. I think I'll just stop here. I've got a lot more slides. I was going to go on to talk about the importance of public openness, which is something that we stress at the NRC. But let me stop here and go to whatever questions and whatever direction you want.
Thank you, Pete. Commissioner Lyons' remarks, as well as his responses to any questions you might have, are off the record. We're using the Chatham House rule as we usually do for these meetings. Please identify yourself and your organization when you ask your question. Yes. Are there any questions? Yes.
I'm Bob Hershey.
Hang on one second, Bob. You've got a microphone because we are being, it is being webcast. So.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What is happening at Nuclear Regulatory Commission on materials and their effects with long-term operation of the reactors? Things like fatigue or other things.
Long-term material aging is a major issue. As, again, most of you probably know, there has been a substantial interest in this country in license renewals. Licenses are initially issued for 40 years. To date, I believe the number is that we have renewed 48 licenses. I believe we have either 12 or 14 renewals pending. Those are for 20 years. As you go from 40 years to 60 years in operation, you do introduce a number of questions, and there has been substantial research, substantial development of so-called generic aging criteria that are applied in all of these renewal considerations. However, it's also important to recognize, and we sometimes have to remind folks who may express some degree of concern about some of our renewals, that very little in a power plant is original equipment. Almost everything, not the pressure vessel, but almost everything is subject to replacement, refurbishment, constant inspection, and in many cases replacement, including of components that I find staggeringly large, components that when the plants were built, I don't think anyone ever anticipated replacing steam generators. That's now reasonably routine now. In any case, excellent question. We continue to work on a number of issues related to aging. We believe we are taking a suitably cautious approach on aging issues, and we also are looking towards what we anticipate will be a new round of substantial research in this area when the question starts to come up of, okay, now do we go for another renewal? Are plants safe to go from 60 to 80 years? I would be amazed if that question doesn't come up. It's not going to come up for a while, but it is going to come up. And we have long-range research programs starting to look at that. National laboratories are a very key component of our research efforts in aging issues. Anyway, good question. I believe handling that very carefully.
Questions? Yes.
Great.
Craig Hansen from Babcock and Wilcox. Pete, you mentioned a couple of times the global nuclear industry that is developing, and the sourcing of material to a variety of places all around the globe. How is NRC going to assure that those components that are coming in from all over the globe meet the requirements here in the United States?
Well, certainly one answer is we're going to spend a lot of time on airplanes. We already are involved in evaluating quality programs of many overseas vendors. We will continue to do that. As key components are constructed overseas, or in this country, we expect to be notified by the vendor, and we will have inspectors there as necessary. Now, much of our focus is on evaluating the quality control of any of the vendors. We also believe that this is an important attribute of our international cooperation. As we're dealing, just as an example, with the with the regulatory commissions commissions plural in Japan, because there seem to be several. We talk a lot about how they do their inspections, how we do our inspections. It's not as much that we're relying on their inspections or accepting them in lieu of ours, but we do recognize that it is important that the country regulators certainly share our view, and certainly the Japanese do, on the importance of quality in everything that's done in vendors in those countries. We've sometimes talked that perhaps our biggest concern is not on the major components. On the major components, the steam generators, the pressure vessels, there's no question that we will have QC very carefully evaluating as those are constructed. But we are concerned about a lot of the smaller components, everything down to the fasteners, the nuts and bolts. Again, that's another area where we think that cooperation on the international stage can help, in the sense that to the extent anyone anywhere in the world sees a problem with counterfeit or substandard components, it's just vitally important that all regulators around the world know that immediately. And I think we're building those bridges to accomplish that. In any case, Craig, significant challenge to the extent, obviously, that increased manufacturing can take place in this country. It greatly simplifies our life, greatly simplifies the utilities' lives, and certainly helps balance of payments, which isn't the NRC's business. But I'm very hopeful that more companies, maybe you don't want the competition, but I'm hoping that more companies will see the opportunities if the Renaissance does take place, and that we'll see more of a rebirth in manufacturing capability with the end stamp in the U.S. By the way, on the comment about Chatham House rules, I don't know if there's any press here or not, but if there are, and if you want to talk about anything specific on the record afterwards, just tell me, and that's fine. I might choose words slightly differently, but anyway.
Questions? Yes.
Stephen Dolly with Platts. Couple quick GNEP-related questions, since you asked for those. Since the initiative was announced, I guess just a little over a year ago, DOE has really sort of wiped the slate clean and redesigned it fundamentally at least a few times, and that will probably pose some challenges for the agency in terms of licensing and regulating the GNEP facilities when and if they're ultimately constructed. How is the agency going about implementing its phased approach to the licensing of GNEP facilities down the line? And second, since it's a somewhat longer-term initiative and those facilities aren't going to be available for a while, do you see a role for conventional reprocessing and recycling in the United States, possibly by exporting U.S. commercial spent fuel to France or another nation for reprocessing?
Let me take them in the reverse order. The NRC's role in export would be the export licensing. As an example, if it were to go to La Hague or Sellafield, the regulation would the regulation of the reprocessing would be subject to the regulations of that country. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't be talking to the regulators, but we would not have that responsibility. So the NRC has a limited responsibility in the possibility of, as you said, conventional reprocessing overseas. Speaking personally, and not for the NRC, I happen to think that's a very smart thing to do. I believe that to the extent there is a sustainable nuclear renaissance in this country, we have to move towards reprocessing. There is limited expertise in this country. There is some, but there is limited expertise in this country on reprocessing, and it would certainly take us a while to get up to speed. To me, the recent suggestions, which have been in the press lately, make a lot of sense. But I don't see that as specifically an NRC role, or at least I see that we would have an extremely limited role in the policy questions as to whether or not that should be pursued. Now, on the challenges of NRC and GNEP facilities, I could only say you're not kidding, it's a challenge. And I believe you also mentioned to some changes in plans for GNEP, and we too, have noted that there's been a number of different approaches proposed for GNEP, quite different, at least from what I can see, quite different from some of the earlier proposals and what's being discussed today. The exact role of the NRC in licensing of those facilities remains to be seen. If the advanced burner reactor were to go ahead, I think it's quite clear in the Energy Policy Act of '92 that we would license that. I think on the other facilities it's much less clear. To the extent that the facilities are commercial size and intended for commercial application, then I think it's clear that the NRC would handle the licensing. To the extent that DOE handles these as internal R&D facilities, then we would not license them unless Congress tells us to, which Congress could easily choose to do. I think all I'm really pointing out is that our role remains uncertain. We do have a memorandum, I can't remember if we called it memorandum of agreement or memorandum of cooperation, one of the two, with or between DOE and the NRC, reflecting the importance of our involvement with DOE as they continue to finalize and develop the different technologies and finalize on a path forward. Well, they finalize along with Congress agreeing, since those are two prerequisites. There's no question that eventually, assuming success of the GNEP types initiatives, that NRC would have to be heavily involved in the licensing. And at some point, such facilities would have to become commercial, I think, to be successful or to be deemed a success. We would have to be involved. So we're certainly looking forward to learning as DOE proceeds through the research programs, whether or not, and we'll just have to wait and see on the initial extent of our licensing responsibilities, Steve. So it's not a complete answer, but I don't think it's possible to give you one because I couldn't tell you on any given day exactly what GNEP is. And certainly Congress still has to weigh in on this as well.
Thank you. Seth Gray from Authority of Power. And it's really two questions, Commissioner. One is, with so many countries announcing an intent to deploy a nuclear program, are many of them approaching the NRC and seeking cooperation in setting up their own regulatory authority? And the second is near the bottom of your slide on the screen where you note the lack of the U.S. manufacturing base. In the planning phase as an overseas project for developing new facilities, be it upgrading pressure vessel forgings in Korea or elsewhere, are companies coming to the NRC in advance and looking for cooperation relating to components that will be manufactured there for export to the U.S.?
I may ask you to expand on your last question, Seth, but at least on the first one, as companies are announcing their intents, well, they're being announced in many different ways. I mentioned I was at the General Conference a month ago. There's an amazing array of countries that seem to be expressing interest in nuclear power. I think it's very positive that the IAEA has undertaken a set of publications within the last year trying to lay out sort of what does it mean if you think you're going to get into nuclear power, and trying to lay out the full range of, let's say, infrastructure types of things that have to be in place, of which regulation is certainly one, but it's by no means the only. Some countries are coming to us and asking for assistance. We certainly welcome that. All of our regulations are public. We have many arrangements where international regulators have spent periods of time up to a year with the NRC. It's kind of interesting as I move around the country and with different regulators how many of them, how many of the leaders around the world have spent 6 months or a year at the NRC. But having said that, let me just say that I am concerned with the number of countries, developing countries, that seem to have an extraordinarily naive view of what it takes to move into nuclear power. At that General Conference, I heard some countries who viewed GNEP sort of as another step towards instant nuclear power. As another example, I was at a conference on regulatory research in France a few months ago. Many countries were there. And there was some talk about contracting that, the pros and cons of contracting that research out between countries. And a developing country, and maybe I shouldn't name them here, stood up and started to talk about how wonderful it was that they would now be able to purchase regulatory expertise, as was being discussed at this conference, and how they plan to go off and buy certain nuclear power plants, and how with GNEP, in their view, they were assured of fuel, and this was just wonderful. They could have nuclear power in a few years. I think I can say who the speaker was at the time. It was Jacques Repoussard, who heads IRSN in France. He gave the most brilliant response. He said, "Sir, you've just described the next Chernobyl." And to me, that's a very appropriate response. Particularly the current generation of primarily light water plants are not plants that you want to be handing to amateurs. There may be advanced designs that would offer a more robust safety case. That remains to be proven. But a light water reactor requires a significant infrastructure, educational, regulatory, lots of different types of infrastructure. And for a country to pretend that they're going to go off and outsource that, to me, is just horrifying. Now, I'm not really sure I followed your second question, Seth. It had to do with components.
I'll rephrase it. You mentioned that people from the commission may be spending a lot of time on airplanes.
Well, not commission, but our inspectors.
Your inspectors.
Well, we do too.
Okay. If Americans are interested in investing in an overseas project that will produce components that could be intended for export back to the U.S. for use in new plants, could or would there be an NRC role before the blueprints and construction of that facility in another country?
Well, there certainly could be. I can't honestly point to a case where that's actually happening. What we require in terms of quality, in terms of code compliance, is no secret. If individuals need to come talk with us on what we would expect, we would be happy to have those discussions. Certainly the minimum would be the N stamp. But I honestly can't point to anyone doing that. Maybe they have and I don't know it. But it probably wouldn't be at the commission level. It would be on our construction and inspection staff.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Al Goodwin, Savannah River National Lab. Public opinion would need to be swayed somewhat if there was going to be a renaissance in the nuclear power industry, and I'm wondering how much NRC is doing or plans on doing to try to sway that. And kind of a two-parter there, has there been any comparison between industries, particularly coal mining and uranium mining, in terms of safety records? Because the only thing we hear is bad news out of coal mining, and you don't hear anything uranium mining.
Well, number one, the NRC will stay very, very carefully out of anything that can smack of promotion. And public opinion, molding public opinion would get very close to promotion. Now, we do try, and you might tell us how successfully, with a website to be educational. We would like to be the first source of information for people needing or having information type requests about nuclear power, and we have put a lot of effort into that website. But beyond that, I'm not terribly sure what the NRC should do or could do. It's much closer to the promotional role that certainly falls to the Department of Energy or to industry. Now, that doesn't mean I don't pay attention to the polls. And in fact, two of the fascinating presentations a week ago that I referenced right in this room were evaluations of public opinion polls and discussions about, I wasn't even aware that there are people who do very serious research evaluating opinion polls and what they really are or aren't saying. There's certainly the ones that NEI regularly releases, which I'm sure have degrees of credibility, and they were included in his studies, but so were many others from Gallup and a lot of other places. From anything I see, probably, and I think it's consistent with the speakers last week, probably on the average, certainly opinions for nuclear power are significantly more favorable, and probably somewhat greater than half would be interested in nuclear power. But as was pointed out last week, how you ask the question gets vastly different answers. I've also found it very interesting where people have polled areas around existing plants, where there tends to be a much, much higher support for additional nuclear plants. In my mind, at least, I hope that's because they understand the safety case, they understand the operation, they understand the safety, and they understand the precautions that goes into nuclear power. Did you have a second? If you had a second question, I didn't write it down.
The second part of that was, are you aware of any comparisons between
coal that's why, yeah, I didn't write it down because I was sort of, I couldn't think of anything to say. I would assume that a very quick Google search would lead to some fascinating statistics. We've all heard astronomical numbers for the number of coal fatalities per year, whether you include only the miners or whether you include miners plus various pulmonary complications. There's a rather substantial case to be made here, is certainly, I'm sure you're hinting at. I don't think it's up to the NRC to make that case. Maybe an interesting comment is who should make that case. It gets, let's just say there are very few utilities that would take on that case, because most utilities have a divided allegiance, let's say. They have many coal facilities, and that would also be true of NEI. The majority of their members would have a wide range of different generating options available. I think you're asking a good question, but I'm not at all sure who should be the one to take that on, and I'm pretty sure it better not be the NRC. And I think that a Google search would be very informative.
Yes.
Hi, Commissioner. I'm Diane Lynn. I'm in the EPA's enforcement program, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the storage and disposal of waste that's generated from these facilities. How much is generated, what the level of contamination is, if there are any new innovations in disposal and storage. Thank you.
For high-level waste or in general? Well, certainly on high-level waste. We referred earlier to GNEP. GNEP offers a number of very innovative approaches to moving ahead with high-level waste in this country. I'm frequently asked whether I believe that the current storage of high-level waste is safe. In fact, we were asked this, sort of asked it, in testifying to Senate EPW last week, or at least we had a senator who was suggesting that it was not safe. In my view, and I'm sure it's unanimous with all the commissioners, the way we are storing high-level waste today, dry casks and spent fuel pools, is safe. We're doing that at the existing plants. It certainly is adequately safe. But to me, and what I said to Senator Saunders last week, to me it's a completely different question as to whether the NRC says that is safe and whether Congress says that is appropriate public policy. And to me, if Congress wished to modify the current situation in which high-level waste is being stored of necessity at the reactor sites, then Congress could certainly move in a number of different directions to try to provide alternative national strategies for high-level waste. But right now we have only one, Nuclear Waste Policy Act and its amendments. The only policy on the table is geologic repository, and the only repository on the table now is Yucca, at least until proven otherwise. But that's Congress who's mandated that. So I've tried to separate safety from public policy. And I don't know that I scored any points last week, but at least in my mind, those are two night and day questions. Now, there's lots of other waste forms. Decommissioning of a plant certainly will result in very large quantities of waste of a variety of different classifications. I think we have a major problem brewing in this country, or you could say already brewed in this country, with Class B and C waste. The vast majority of waste is Class A, and there's many things that the utilities can do, many things that many of you know, such that by changing their operations they could generate less B and more A. And for Class A waste, there are options in the country. There are commercial facilities that are operating that take Class A. But for Class B and C, we've got a major problem in this country. And I think it's very likely to be one that's going to come back in the lap of Congress. We have the so-called compact system in this country, which I can't imagine how you could conclude it's anything other than an abysmal failure. I think it's fair to say that there's been no new low-level waste facility opened in this country based on whose origin was based on the compact system. Nevertheless, we have the compact system. Barnwell, again, as I'm sure many of you know, Barnwell is the only place right now in the country that is either 34 or 37 states, like one of those two. It's the only place they can take Class B and C waste is Barnwell. Barnwell is going to close to out-of-compact waste next year, 2008. That leaves the country with no open facility for Class B and C. From the NRC's perspective, we believe we're going to have a substantial challenge to assure that wastes of the Class B and C nature are stored safely. And we're very concerned that the situation may, if you will, degenerate such that for people who just don't have a place to store it, don't have the funds to store it, whatever, that we have some unsafe conditions developing. I think it may well fall to Congress to solve the B and C problem. There is, as I understand it, still a possibility that the WCS facility in Texas may possibly be permitted for B and C and may possibly be permitted for out of compact wastes. But I don't think that's for sure at all. And by the way, my concern in this is not for the major utilities. They know how to store Class B and C waste. They've already got high-level waste on site. They know what they're doing. They got lots of storage options. My concern is the research labs and the hospitals. They also generate Class B and C waste. Not a lot of it, but they do generate it. And those are the ones that I think we've got potentially a very serious challenge coming in this country. And we have debated a little bit as a commission. I think it will keep coming up as to whether a formal statement from the NRC to Congress is appropriate to say that certainly we would recommend that Congress move back into the low-level waste debates. I'm sure that there are very few members, if any, of Congress who want to take that on. It's probably not a great vote getter, but it is important. And there's still a chance that the operations in Texas will provide an option.
Any further questions? Let me use the chair's prerogative. Commissioner Lyons, you mentioned you had personal views on the India deal, and I'd certainly be interested in hearing them.
I had the fabulous experience of being in India about 2 weeks after the initial agreement between the President and the Prime Minister. And I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with the Indian research facilities and a number of their reactors. I came away very, very convinced that if anyone thinks we're going to hold India back in nuclear technology by not having an agreement with them, they are crazy. India has superb command of nuclear technologies. They are building indigenous reactors, and they are building very good indigenous reactors. Now, they are doing it on the thorium cycle. They are working towards the thorium cycle, and they are also working towards introduction of fast reactors in the thorium cycle. I came away convinced that India is completely capable on their own of moving ahead with a highly professional nuclear power program, moving towards a thorium cycle, moving towards fast reactors. I also came away convinced that if, through increased cooperation with the West, it's possible for India to take advantage of, and for us, well, mutually take advantage of capabilities they have and we have, that it's much more likely that India will be quite interested in moving towards light water technologies, at least as a possibility in the immediate future, and perhaps not moving ahead with the fast breeder types of systems for their thorium cycle. To me, it's just far more in the U.S. interests to be a contributing partner with India in shaping the direction of their fuel cycle and the development of their nuclear power industry. And my main message, and I certainly shared it to a number of colleagues on the Hill, anyone who thinks that we are going to hold back India's nuclear development by withholding U.S. cooperation just doesn't understand the level of their technology. I realize this is far more than a U.S. decision. There's the whole nuclear suppliers group, very, very complicated issues. But, Joe, in my mind, the U.S., India, and India global community agreements are very, very important and have tremendous benefits around the world for us and for India. And probably some of you don't agree with me.